address the questions before that the faithful had to experience exactly. Mass. And again, without getting into all the history, there is a lot of history around that Taviani intervention. Cardinal Taviani was, he wasn't just a random cardinal. One can speak like this, the head of the then Holy Office, a theologian, someone who carried a certain weight.
Of course.
So,
his voice had a lot of weight.
Yeah.
And I think they are basically saying to the Pope, please do not do this. So I'm taking a few quotations just from the cover letter and then from their conclusion of the short critical study. So I'll just read these. So in their cover letter, they say, the Novus Ordo, the new Mass, represents both as a whole and in its details a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated in session 22 of the Council of Trent. So it is a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass, which is just shy of saying it's not Catholic. It's departing from what we think the Mass is in it as a whole and its details. And then they say further, and I think this is connecting with our principles of affecting the mentality. They say the innovations in the Novus Ordo and the fact that all that is of perennial value finds only a minor place, if it subsists at all, could well turn into a certainty the suspicion, already prevalent, alas, in many circles, that truths which have always been believed by the Christian people can be changed or ignored without infidelity to that sacred deposit of doctrine to which the Catholic faith is bound forever. Recent reforms have amply demonstrated that fresh changes in the liturgy could lead to nothing but complete bewilderment on the part of the faithful. So I think there you have a specific reference to a mentality. So it's going to turn into a certainty the idea that you can simply change things that are of the deposit of faith. That the real presence, if it's too hard, you can simply forget about it. Don't emphasize it. Don't worry about it. Okay. And they're saying that deposit, that sacred deposit of doctrine, the Catholic is bound to that forever. If you wish to be saved, you must believe what is the faith, what the Catholic faith teaches. So that's a very strong statement. And then the last statement, their concluding sentence, is perhaps the most striking. They say the following as a conclusion. They say to abandon a liturgical tradition which for 4 centuries was both the sign and the pledge of unity of worship, and to replace it with another which cannot but be a sign of division by virtue of the countless liberties implicitly authorized, and which teems with insinuations or manifest errors against the integrity of the Catholic religion, is, we feel in conscience bound to proclaim an incalculable error. And so there are 2 striking things for me there, that they claim it teems, there's many, many insinuations or manifest errors against the integrity of the Catholic religion in this Mass, and included with that the general instruction. And then they say we feel bound in conscience to proclaim that this would be an incalculable error, meaning it will do much damage to many souls. You can't calculate the effect of it. And that's how great it is. And I would say we are, in fact, living through, fortunately, the fulfillment of this prediction with regard to this.
So before we move on, is it a good time to introduce this distinction, which to me is perhaps implicit in this critique of the cardinals, between the Mass itself, the rite of the Mass, meaning the prayers that surround the consecration, the sacrifice, the structure of the Mass, as opposed to like the Easter rites, or exactly the same Mass can be traditionally, let's say, surrounded and incorporated into different rites. And then I guess the third distinction would be abuses, right? Because I mentioned that third distinction because, again, sometimes people will recognize that there are abuses and they want to stop there. But I think implicit in, maybe not, maybe it's explicit, the abuse, the permission or tolerance for abuse itself is sort of baked into when you're right. So when you see abuses, it's not, it's
not being prevented anyway by the rite. And I think that's true. The cardinals do say that basically this is going to open the door to many abuses. But they also say that the rite itself, as it's written, so not celebrated concretely in this or that place by Father X. They're saying the rite itself is deficient, and is deficient precisely in those points that are clearly defined by the Council of Trent as to our understanding of the Mass.
Okay.
So, and I think there, it's not even for them, it's not a question of is it valid or invalid.
Yeah.
It's a question of what is the rite, all the prayers and the ceremonies surrounding the double consecration. What are they doing? What are they showing to the faithful? What are they showing to God? And they're saying they're not adequately showing the Catholic understanding of what's going on in the double consecration. So a defect in the rite itself, basically.
Okay. So let's move to the purpose of the changes in the Mass. I mean, it's true that this quote you just mentioned references a departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as formulated the Council of Trent. Of course, Trent didn't invent any of these doctrines. They clarified at times, they codified at times. So we are looking at the broad tradition of the Catholic Church's own understanding of what the Mass is. Of course, in the 20th century, in different ways, changes to the Mass were anticipated and then introduced. So let's steel man their reformer side. What they tried, what was the intention behind their changes to the Mass?
Right, and in one sense, I think here's where you can say, okay, if this is the right and it is deficient, according if we agree with the cardinals, then are we going to say was that a mistake, as in trying to make legitimate changes, they ended up going too far? Or what was their intention, basically? And I think this is where I think again it's a little bit naive not to pay attention to what has been said by the various persons involved in manufacturing, that's a bit of a loaded word, but crafting this rite. And very simply, I think we can say, and I'm being a little bit summing up here to some extent, but very simply the motivation for changing the Mass was precisely to make it approach more closely to Protestant services in an explicitly ecumenical effort. So in other words, the effort is to appeal to Protestants to help show that we share many things, we're closer than we think, even though some things still separate us, we are brethren, we are still both followers of Christ, and we're going to do that by changing our worship so that it looks closer to what the Protestants are okay with.
Okay.
And when you line up the changes that have been made and what the Council of Trent said about the Mass and what Protestants think about the Mass, you find that it corresponds in every point. And then when you further look at sentences and statements and perspectives by, for example, Father Annibale Gugnini, the famous author of the New Mass, or again, Jean Guiton, the personal friend of Paul VI. We have quotations from them, we have writings from them saying the intention is to make this closer to Protestant services. That I think is very clear. And then when you read the general instruction that accompanied the Mass, the language is also being changed to be acceptable to Protestants, almost impossible to is called assembly. Is no longer defined primarily as the sacrifice, but more like the meal. Sacred synaxis, and so on, all these terms. And then furthermore, we have a testimony on the other side of what have Protestants said about this Mass. Well, they have said that a Protestant can, in fact, celebrate this Mass and still remain a Protestant. And I think that's one of the most striking testimonies, because we didn't ask them to say that. They just offered that, and they said, "Yeah, I don't have to change my thinking in order to celebrate this rite." So all of that to say, what is the intention of the reform? It's to make the mass Protestant, and that is to say, and if that sounds too strong, remember it is an ecumenical effort. It is an effort to say we need unity between Catholics and Protestants, at least in our worship now.
Yeah.
And I want to, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but one could say, okay, well, maybe, you know, God writes straight with crooked lines, or the Holy Ghost is still going to come in and operate, and all that kind of thing. And so maybe this was the intention of these people, like Bernini, and so on. But is this right not salvageable in some way, or is it not clear that since then we're still Catholic, and saying it as Catholics, it's all fine, and so on. And here's where I think again we don't want to be blind to what the highest authority in the church has been saying for the last decades. Every single pope since that time has made a statement that says the goal, our goal in the ecumenical movement, is to move closer to the Protestants, and specifically through some kind of visible unity, some kind of praying together, therefore some kind of liturgy, some kind of shared liturgy. And this, I think, comes out very strongly in, as I said, pretty much all the popes. So John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Pope Francis, Pope Leo. So to show that this idea of an ecumenical effort that's going to make our liturgy closer to theirs is still something that the popes in recent times want.
Okay.
That's my point here.
So you're positing that both chronologically and in principle logically, the ecumenical movement is actually what precedes the liturgical changes.
Yes.
And this is both, as I say, chronologically and in their minds. This is the idea. The idea is to craft, again, terminology may be poor there, to develop a liturgy which is in the aims of which are along the lines of this broader ecumenical project.
Right. Just to show that we are closer. And in one sense, you understand the idea of trying to say, let's work together. For example, if you have something like abortion and you want to fight against abortion, we want an army of people. So we want all the Protestants who think that abortion is bad too. So let's say, hey, we're all together on this issue.
Sure.
In one sense, that's part of it. We understand that. But then in another sense, you can say, hold on, if this means that we're starting to change the way we pray and worship God, so that we're no longer doing it according to the truths that we hold, such as the real presence, then that's a major issue, I think.
Well, and maybe to draw a distinction, I believe at the Council of Trent, of course, the timing being shortly after the Protestant Reformation, a belated perhaps attempt to reconcile the Protestants to the Church on the liturgical front at the time. I believe there were Council Fathers that were looking for ways to legitimately find common ground, meaning are there things which we could concede that are not questions of principle? I know one of the things that was proposed by some of them maybe communion under both kinds, which was allowed at a certain point in the history of the church, or in certain parts of the church. Maybe that would be a kind of legitimate concession. Of course, they soon realized that the principles were far too divergent to even bridge that gap with something. What you're talking about is not this kind of, hey, maybe we could, maybe there are ways we could legitimately clarify, change some certain things.
Right.
This is entirely different.
This is different. This is a question of what do we need to surrender as Catholics, or hide as Catholics, to make it seem that we are closer to the Protestants. And I really think it comes down to that, because no Protestant is going to agree with us on the real presence. And so if a Protestant says, well, in your